Relieving a manager of his duties is not an easy task. He may have been doing a poor job and not meeting expectations despite doing his best. If a team has suffered several consecutive losing seasons under said manager, it's clear he isn't doing his job and needs to go. Often, a manager will also be let go despite success if he isn't living up to expectations. Typically, if a team is doing well, or at least average, a manager will be fired after the season ends. It's not uncommon to see managers let go mid-season, but usually that's because the team is severely underperforming and has no playoff expectations. Although rare, we have seen teams fire a manager mid-season while they aren't far off from a playoff spot. In 2018, the St. Louis Cardinals fired manager Mike Matheny after a 47-46 start. Interim manager Mike Shildt guided the club to a 41-28 record the rest of the way, narrowly missing the playoffs. That is an understandable situation. The Cardinals had missed the playoffs the previous 2 seasons and were well on their way to another lackluster year. A change needed to be made. Making the change at the midway point is the right call. It gave enough time for the Cardinals to see if Matheny can turn it around, but allowed enough time for the interim manager to attempt to right the ship. But what about a playoff contending team that fires their manager a little closer to the end of the season? Certainly, if a team is in playoff contention near the end of the season, the manager is doing something right. Disrupting team chemistry could be detrimental to a club, especially so late in a season. There doesn't seem to be a good reason for a team to fire their manager when they're in playoff contention near the end of the season. Well, this has happened before. A manager was once fired from a baseball team in a playoff spot with less than 2 weeks left in the season. This is the story of the 2008 Milwaukee Brewers. Before getting into who the Brewers manager was and the situation at hand, we need to look into the Brewers' history leading up to 2008. The Milwaukee Brewers started as a franchise in 1969 and through the first nearly 40 years of existence had 2 playoff appearances with 0 World Series wins. They lost in the first round of the 1981 playoffs and lost in the World Series in 1982, and that's it. No playoff appearances in 25 years and such a little success to begin with. After a decade of losing seasons in the 90s and early 2000s, the Brewers brought in Ned Yost to manage the ball club ahead of the 2003 season. Yost was able to turn the team around, guiding them to a .500 record in 2005 and a winning record in 2007. That winning record was their first since 1992. That 2007 season was nothing to celebrate, however. The Brewers got off to a hot start and were 47-33 with a 7.5 game lead over the Cubs for first place in the NL Central entering July. Milwaukee had a disastrous second half, going 20-34 in July and August. A late season comeback fell short and the Brewers finished in second place, 2 games out of a playoff spot. Ned Yost was ejected from 3 different games in the final week of the season. After the loss where the Brewers were eliminated from playoff contention, Yost commented saying he was glad to make it through a game without getting ejected. That might be one of the worst things a manager can say in that situation. Despite the collapse, Yost had support from the team owner as well as the general manager. He was coming back for the 2008 season. With a team ready to compete, the Brewers were poised to make a postseason run. With Yost on the hot seat, if he couldn't guide Milwaukee to a playoff appearance in 2008, he might as well be out of a job. The first half of the 2008 season was up and down for Milwaukee. The Brewers were constantly battling a .500 record, tilting within a few games above and below .500 for the better part of the first 3 months. It was underwhelming, and their performance sparked a website called FireNedYost.com. Yep, that really existed. The team eventually pulled ahead and were 11 games over .500 entering the All-Star break. It was also prior to the All-Star break where the club traded for veteran pitcher CC Sabathia. The Brewers kept winning, having a terrific July and August. Entering September, Milwaukee was 80-56. Despite being 4.5 games behind the Cubs for first place, they were 5.5 games ahead of the Phillies for the wild card. In 2008, there was only one wild card. With 26 games left, the Brewers had a decent lead, and they weren't even too far off from the division lead. It seemed like everything was going right. They were nearly 25 games over .500 and on the cusp of their first playoff appearance in a quarter of a century. it didn't go exactly as planned. The Brewers started September losing 4 straight and 12 of 15. On September 14th, the Brewers lost their 4th game in a row to the Philadelphia Phillies. With that loss, the Brewers and Phillies were now tied for the wild card. Milwaukee had coughed up a 5.5 game lead in 2 weeks. Not only were they tied for the wild card, they fell 7.5 games back of the Cubs for the division. Any hope for that division lead was gone, and it appeared that the Brewers were once again going to blow their playoff hopes for a 2nd consecutive season. Not only were the Brewers now in a tie for the wild card, there was insult to injury. On the same day, there was a no-hitter thrown in Milwaukee, but it didn't involve the Brewers. The Brewers were on the road in Philadelphia, but there was a game played at Miller Park. Due to damage done by Hurricane Ike in the Houston area, the Astros-Cubs game was moved to Milwaukee, where the Cubs' Carlos Zambrano no-hit the Astros. It was the first no-hitter thrown in Milwaukee in nearly 35 years at that point, and the Brewers didn't even get to be a part of it. Anyway, after that September 14th loss to the Phillies, the Brewers management came together to make a bizarre yet crucial move. They fired Ned Yost. They fired Ned Yost despite being in a tie for the final playoff spot with 12 games left to play. It was the first time in baseball history a team fired their manager after July despite being in a playoff spot. Third base coach Dale Swaim was named the interim manager, trying to avoid the collapse. It's almost unthinkable to perceive a team making this kind of move, and yet it makes sense for this one situation. No team would fire a manager this late in a season when they're in a playoff spot because it shows the manager was a contributor to the team's success. If a team is winning, why fire the manager? This is a special case. It was crystal clear the Brewers were good not because of Yost, but in spite of Yost. They needed to get him out, as it appeared he was going to be the reason the Brewers would have another late season meltdown. If Milwaukee collapsed in the second half for a 2nd consecutive season, the blame has to go somewhere, and typically the manager is there to take it. To change the environment of the coaching staff and team chemistry with such few games left is a big gamble. Dale Swaim had never managed a single game when he took over as interim manager, and the Brewers were in free fall. That begs the question, did this move work? Yes. The Brewers went 7-5 in their final 12 games and clinched the wildcard spot on the final game of the season. Milwaukee had made the playoffs for the first time in 26 years. They would lose in the first round to the Phillies, but the risky, bizarre, and controversial move to fire Ned Yost in mid-September paid off. The Brewers did, under an interim manager, what they couldn't do under Ned Yost. They made the playoffs.